Welcome to Iron Rhetoric with your intrepid host, Pastor Brett McAtee. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. And yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own.
All right, well, good day to you, be it morning, evening, or afternoon, wherever you are, whatever time you're listening. We welcome you to Iron Rhetoric. Thankful for my sidekick, Matt Smith. Wouldn't be able to get this done or do this without him. He's the one who makes the engine go. Today we're looking at, again, at the issue of, we're looking at an issue that is not something that I'm pursuing so much as I'm being pursued, or at least the convictions that I have are being pursued. Actually, the guy in the crosshairs in a couple of these is Stephen Wolfe. And actually, I'm coming to the defense of Stephen Wolfe, even if Wolfe and I have substantial disagreements in our basic understanding of how philosophy works. But when it comes to the nuts and bolts, it seems that I don't know if he likes hearing this or not, but it seems like Wolfe and I are in the same bed together, and that's just a metaphor. Thank you very much. What I want to look at today in a couple of posts is I want to look at some of these older guys, supposedly guys my age. When I say older, I'm talking about P. Andrew Sandlin in the first podcast here, and then I'm looking at Joe Boot in the second one. I'm not sure how old Joe is. I think Sandlin's a little bit older than me. Maybe we can find that out before we go to the Boot extract. But these guys definitely have a thing against racial realism, ethno-nationalism, familialism, kinism. I don't know what word you want to use, but really it's becoming the topic du jour. It's like people can't get away from it. Even Chris Gordon, which we might get into him today, he's critiquing Christian nationalism, postmillennialism from an R2K perspective. And the advantage of looking at Chris Gordon, if we get to it, is that he reveals to us how R2K ends up being in the camp of the alienists on this matter. It does seem that, unfortunately, it is often the boomers. And I got to tell you, I hate having the phrase boomer cast into my teeth. First of all, because technically I'm not a boomer, although somebody could argue that I'm that age. But also, it's just a weak response. Let's deal with the ideas and not the generation that somebody's coming from. But you know what? I'm beginning to understand why people just cast the phrase boomer into people's teeth, because it's just the things that these guys are saying is so typical of this mindset. And so we turn to Sandlin first, and you can follow this on Iron Ink if you want to. Usually what I do before I podcast, not always, but usually I'll post something on Iron Ink. And in this case, somebody sent me a couple quotes from P. Andrew Sandlin, or Andy, as he's affectionately known. Keep in mind that Andy was one of R.J. Rushdoony's lieutenants before Rushdoony passed away. And I will say this before we get into this, the details of what we're doing here. I will say that I love Rushdoony. I look at my bookshelf right now, and I can see whole shelves full of Rushdoony books. But that doesn't mean I think he walked on water, and I don't expect that when the day comes, people will think I walked on water. I think if he made mistakes, but one of the mistakes was the people he surrounded himself with. He surrounded himself with a bunch of doofuses. Again, there are exceptions. I want to make that clear, but when you think of guys like Gary North and P. Andrew Sandlin and Colonel Dorner and others, there was just a bunch of people that couldn't wear Rushdoony's shoes and who have carried on his legacy, but I believe have not caught the essence of who the man was. And so as a consequence, I'm reading more and more people railing against theonomists as if theonomy is the problem, when it's not theonomy, it's a problem. It's the lieutenants that surrounded Rushdoony that have cast it in a different shape than Rushdoony himself. Remember, my contention is that Rushdoony himself was a crypto-kinist. In other words, he didn't develop it because in his time frame, it wasn't the burning issue. But you read his stuff, and it's pointing in that direction. Definitely pointing in that direction. Now, when I say crypto, that doesn't mean he isn't without inconsistencies or contradictions. You can find other stuff that he writes that is contradiction. But the majority report, especially in the older Rushdoony stuff, is of a ethno-nationalist, kinist, racial realist bent. But back to his one of his chief lieutenants, Sandlin. Sandlin wrote online. He might have wrote this elsewhere, but I got it off his Facebook place. He wrote a couple quotes. We'll deal with them one at a time. He wrote, and I'm quoting Andy here. Andy says, quote, "The young new church Nazis find the Imago Dei troublesome because it reflects the unity of humanity and God's created order. All humans are created in the image of God. That unity is a threat to white nationalism, just as white nationalism is a threat to the gospel of Jesus Christ." Read Galatians. And it's more than marginally ironic that many of these same younglings that champion nature at war with God's created order, unquote. Now notice a couple of things before we start here. Twice he talks about young guys. He starts with saying the young new church Nazis, all right? And then later in the quote, he talks about these same younglings. I cannot fault the 30-something to 40-something crowd for being outraged with the older guys like Sandlin, and I guess even like me. Unfortunately, I get lumped into that category. Because the older guys like Sandlin, like Wilson, like Boot, Gary North when he was alive, the older guys are just they're just pissing on the younger guys and calling it rain. All right? Maybe if you want to be nice, you'll say leaking instead of the other word. But anyway, they're just attacking these young guys viciously. And we can see the viciousness in hurling the Nazi sobriquet at them. Not only does Sandlin do it, then Boot hints at it, and Doug Wilson has used the word Nazi as well. And I got to tell you, I'm getting to the point where I couldn't give a tinker's damn if you call me a Nazi. And I think these younger guys probably are going to develop the same mentality. You want to call me a Nazi? Fine, I'm a Nazi. The idea that we have a particular love, or suggests that Scripture teaches that a particular love for one's own people, one's own kith and kin, that somehow that is an expression of Nazism. It's just foolishness on steroids. And yet there we go. Over and over again, we're seeing this reached for. And what's so funny is this is the technique of the progressive left. This is what the cultural Marxists do. They take these words, whether it's Nazi, whether it's homophobe, whether it's bigot, whether it's racist, and then they throw it as a conversation ender into the teeth of somebody who's trying to put forth a particular position. And they don't even really know what it means. They just know that they can end the conversation that way. Oh, I win. I win. I called him a Nazi.
It's just like racism. It's becoming an overworked, overused pejorative that doesn't mean anything anymore.
Right. It has no meaning because it means everything. So let's look at Sandlin's quote. He talks about the Imago Dei, which of course is the image of God. That's what Imago Dei means. So as we keep using Imago Dei, understand that means image of God. So we would first note, if the Imago Dei stamps out white nationalism, thus suggesting that all men are the same, then of course, Andy, it's a case that it has to stamp out also differentiation between the sexes. You can't have it both ways, Andy. Either the Imago Dei allows for distinctions among peoples to exist, various peoples, or the Imago Dei requires that we lose the distinctions between men and women. In the end, Sandlin is not arguing for unity. The idiot is arguing for uniformity. He has lost the idea of diversity that's found in the idea of the Trinity, of the one and the many. Sandlin, in brief, whether he realizes it or not, he's advocating for what we would call a social order monism. It's what YouTube sung about when they talked about all colors bleeding into one. Sandlin might as well just find a good Unitarian church to place his membership, because that's what this monism he's advocating is doing. It's not unity. Unity is diversity in unity. It's the harmony of interest. It's the ability for different parts of the body all to operate together. What he's arguing is for the Mao suit uniformity. Everybody dressed like Mao, or the Fergie Cap of the French Revolution, calling each one citoyen, or the comrade of the Soviet Union. That's what the man's arguing for as you tease it out. And what's worse yet is he's laying it all at the door of the Imago Dei, of the doctrine of the image of God. And so it's hard to see how this doesn't begin to inch towards blasphemy, to be honest. Second, we would say in the end here, Sandlin has just baptized the doctrine of egalitarianism. The suggestion here by Sandlin is that because all men equally bear the image of God, the Imago Dei, therefore all men are equal in terms of abilities and predispositions. Further, Sandlin is suggesting that anyone who disagrees with his kindergarten theology is Nazi! On the contrary, Christianity has always taught that men are only equal inasmuch as they are all equally made of dirt, and inasmuch as they all stand as responsible for and are obligated to God and his law, and inasmuch as they all have a sin nature. The Imago Dei does not teach that we're all rolling out of a giant divine cookie cutter and that we can all be like cogs in a machine just replaced in and out because we all have the Imago Dei. And frankly, I'm just shocked. It's been 3 or 4 days since I've written this article, and I'm shocked that this kind of argument is actually being advanced. I'm more shocked that people listen to him. This guy has an organization. I think it's the Center for Cultural Studies or something like that. He goes around and he lectures. He's connected with Joe Boot, and Joe Boot has him in the lecture. And I'm thinking, this guy doesn't deserve to teach in a government school, let alone lecture Christians. Back to the quote. Thirdly, we would say, even the unity in the Christian faith that Sandlin might appeal to is squashed in terms of meaning all converted people are the same. Converted Urdu people will not be the same as converted Mongolian or Inuit people. Grace does not destroy nature, but restores it. Sandlin's appeal to quote-unquote unity because of the Imago Dei does not even work if cast in the context of converted people groups. Neither the common ground of the Imago Dei nor the common ground of conversion drives the uniformity that Sandlin is aiming at. That is a completely Enlightenment idea. It's the idea that was fostered in the garden when Satan said to Eve, "You shall be as God." In other words, you're going to be equal to God. You're going to be the same. Egalitarianism. Egalitarianism was what was pushed in the garden. In terms of putting all this in the context of the church, even St. Paul notes that different people, and we would say different peoples as well, have different gifts to bring to the body in order to help the body excel. Paul didn't say, well, you're all in the Imago Dei, so you're all ears or you're all eyes. No. He talks to people, they're all in the Imago Dei, but he says there's diversity, there's different gifts. And that applies to people groups. Among people groups, among nations, even among families, there's different abilities and talents and gifts. And if you put those families into a social order or social unit, if they're converted, those different gifts and talents can work together. And again, that's called the harmony of interest. But he wants to base the harmony of interest on uniformity and just in the fact that we're created in the image of God. Fourthly, as we consider this quote, by denying these very real racial ethnic distinctions, Sandlin is a functional Gnostic. And Gnosticism, to be honest, is alive and well on the planet Earth. Sandlin is showing he doesn't believe in the material reality that God has created us with. He seems to think that the spiritual reality of being Imago Dei completely negates our creaturely humanness in all of its variegated expressions. Have these people never read a weighty book on the church's first heresy? That is Gnosticism? And by the way, Gnosticism has crept back over and over again through the centuries, poking its head up in different areas and in different ways. And we're dealing with it again with the alienists who keep wanting to suggest that grace destroys nature, that when you're converted, you're no longer white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. When you're converted, you're no longer a Mongolian, if you're a Christian Mongolian. They want to suggest that somehow, because we're in Christ, it eliminates all the creaturely distinctions. I feel like a broken record. I know that probably on this podcast I've been over this before, but man, these guys keep saying it, so I have to keep saying it in return. Fifthly, understand where all this is going for Sandlin. This appeal to the unity of the human race because the Imago Dei is greasing the rails for the normativity of interracial marriages or cross-cultural or cross-racial adoptions and multicultural social order driven by saluting open borders. It's a theology hell-bent on completing the destruction of a once Christian people. All right? Now, we would note here that, and we've said this before, that there can be cross-racial adoptions and interracial marriages that indeed are God-pleasing. It's not always sin to involve oneself all the time. But having said that, it's not normative. And one way I know it's not normative is that just recently I wrote something on this, and I looked up the statistics again, and the statistics on divorce, the divorce rate for interracial relationships is way, way higher than intra-racial marriages. So even on the pragmatic grounds of what the statistics say, it's not a good idea to marry somebody from another race. And that shouldn't be controversial, but this is where we're living. Now, I'll grant that Andy doesn't realize the implications of his positions, but his inability to think consequentially does not mean that what I've observed is any less true. At best, Andy's inability to connect dots means he's merely stupid and not instead just plain wicked. And yeah, this kind of stuff is upsetting to me. And I'm sure you can probably tell. And it's upsetting because I've been over and over again. I have 2,000 years of church history on my side. I have the exegesis of countless church fathers on my side, handling scripture. And yet here I am in 2024, and I have to present all this stuff again. And even when I present it, it doesn't matter. It's just like all of this stuff is dropped down the memory hole. Dow is coming out soon, the second edition of his book, Who is My Neighbor? He adds even more quotes. It becomes more encyclopedic. There's another volume out called Racialism in the Sacred Tradition. I can't remember the name of the author off the top of my head, but he gives a whole 600, 500 pages, whatever it is, of quotes that show that the church history has always understood racial realism, or as I prefer to call it, kinism. Sixthly, we say, pray tell, what is Andy going to do with me? Andy complains about the younglings, but I'm no youngling. So he can't cast that implied aspersion onto me. Honestly, except for a few old-timer chaps like Mark Chambers and Pastor Ross Mahan and myself, it's the younglings who are spot on in resisting in this Nietzschean will to death that we find so prevalent among the Sandlins, the Doug Wilsons, the Joe Booths, the Al Mollers, the James Whites, etc., etc., etc. But you know what? These guys are not going to be able to keep the lid on forever. The lid's already coming off. I mean, I'm seeing it with these 40-something, 30-something guys. One of them is my son. Two of them are my son-in-laws. There are people in my congregation that understand this. They can rail against these young guys all they want. They can hurl epitaphs in their face. That's not epitaphs, that's epithets. Okay? I always get those two mixed up. They can denounce them all they want, but at the end of the day, they're not going to keep the lid on. I'm seeing it more and more out there. We'll see what happens. It's going to get interesting. back to Sandlin's quote, seventh. And I said this earlier, and now I'm going to repeat it. Honestly, the sting of being called a Nazi has lost its bite. Like the accusation of a racist, it means very little to those who have eyes wide open to the Babel Project. Call me a Nazi anymore, I'm just shrugged. It's like calling me an edifix. And don't look up edifix. It's not a word. It doesn't mean anything. Just like Nazi. It means nothing to me. I know in your world, Andy, it's the greatest insult you can cast at somebody, but those who have gotten past the post-war liberal consensus, those who have gotten past, let's better say this, instead of post-war liberal consensus, let's better say the lies that were spun by those in control of the media, don't say Jewish, those who were in control of the Soviet Union, don't say Jewish, those lies are being unwrapped and they're being exposed for what they are. More and more, people are just not caring. The so-called younglings, they just don't give a rat's bottom about your slurs, Andy, or about yours, Joe Boo, or about yours, Doug Wilson. I mean, shoot. Two can play this game. As far as I'm concerned, you guys are all commies. All right? Cultural Marxists, if you prefer. Reds. That's what they desired, right? You do remember that. Or did you forget that in all your training? They desired to see all the world bleed into one. They were John Lennon before John Lennon. Imagine there's no religion and no countries too. That's the first quote. Here's the second quote by Sandlin. Quote, it's just as erroneous and pernicious to equate culture with race as it is to equate intelligence with race. Culture's characteristics are shaped by religion, not by race. Easily proven by the fact that virtually all races have at different times and locations reflected godly religion and its wholesome characteristics, as well as ungodly religion and its unwholesome characteristic. The issue is always religion, never race, unquote. So let's examine this quote. I don't know of anybody within, let's say, the Ogden, Utah group. I don't know among those who follow Wolf. I don't know any among the kinnis that I hang with, and I hang with more than a few. I don't know among any of the natural law nationalists who try to equate culture with race as if there's a one-to-one correspondence. In other words, all of us understand there's a distinction between culture and race, but we say you can't divorce them. However, there is an understanding among many that race is a contributory factor to culture along with religion. Indeed, a good definition of culture is theology poured over ethnicity. To deny that genetics have anything to do with culture and arguing instead that all culture is what goes on between someone's ears is to once again profess allegiance to a Gnostic faith. Scripture teaches, as a man thinketh in his heart, so he is. But notice there that there is a man who is thinking, and that thinking man is the repository of generations of genetics. The material corporeal is real, people. God's grace does not make who we are and our creaturely genetics disappear. Right? And so when you talk about culture, culture is the manifestation of race combined with religion, or as I said earlier, theology poured over genetics. You just can't take genetics or race or ethnicity out of the equation. We are flesh and blood creatures. And to suggest that somehow we can, at some point, because of conversion, we can become spiritual and no longer are in our human self, the sum result of our genetics is just, it's just to erase our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our great-great-grandparents. What grace does is it makes us the best we that we can possibly be. It makes Brett the best Brett he could be. If left in sin and nature's night, then I would be the worst Brett that Brett can be. But because of grace, Brett can be the best Brett that Brett can be. And it's the same way of ethnicities. If grace visits a people group, it's going to raise them to be the best people group that they can be, but they're still going to belong to that people group. It doesn't make it go away. And again, to suggest that it does is just the ancient heresy of Gnosticism. And it's like being in a cage as a lion trainer in a circus with a lion. I feel like I've got a whip in one hand and a chair in the other, and I'm beating back a lion named Boot and a lion named Sandlin and a lion named Wilson, the most ferocious lions out there, and I'm having to beat them back, and there's only a handful of other guys out there that are trying to beat them back as well. And God bless Stephen Wolf. Again, while we may have our disagreements, at least he's doing yeoman's work in beating back these, be nice, Brett, these mistaken people. Thirdly, in this quote, to argue like Andy does, and it's not just Andy of the boomer evangelicals who are arguing in this fashion, leaves one arguing that nature means nothing in the nurture versus nature debate. Sandlinism, if I can call it that, looks to mean that if men can be just programmed to believe the right things, then nature means nothing. Again, Gnosticism. So, just to be clear here, there's not nature and there's nurture. For the Christian, though, there's one more element. There's supernature, the supernatural. God does things with us that is beyond the ability of nature or nurture to completely explain. But what Andy wants to do here, and all these people that are arguing this Gnostic way, this Sandlinism way, is they want to teach that programming is everything. Again, as if what you believe between your ears is the only thing that matters. Fourthly, I think it's disputable that all ethnicities, as Sandlin says, at one time or another have embraced Christianity to such a degree that whole civilizations were built. However, for the sake of argument, let's grant Sandlin's premise. Is he really trying to argue that Pygmy Christians, for example, their culture is going to look the same as Japanese Christian culture or a Hottentot Christian culture? It's mind-boggling to think that the man might actually be arguing something like this, as if the Pygmy, the Hottentot, and the Japanese, once they're converted, are all cogs that now can be used just to replace one another in a social order machine. Yeah, the Apostle Paul, at one of his books, I think it was in Corinthians, said, I must be out of my mind having to argue this way. And that's the way I feel. I feel that if I'm putting myself in their shoes, I must be out of my mind to argue the way that they're arguing. Fifth, of course, race alone, as we said, is not equated to culture, but neither can it be said that religion alone is equated to culture. Culture, as we've said, is the interplay between religion and genetics, between theology and who God created us to be in all of our corporeality. Culture is the outward manifestation of a people's inward beliefs. However, as different peoples are, well, different than even if different peoples embrace the same theology, their cultures will not look the same nor be the same. As I said earlier, a Christian Peruvian people are never going to look the same as a Christian Nedabelli people, are never going to look the same as a Christian Cornish people. To think otherwise puts us on the wrong side of Babel. You see what's going on here is that Boot and Sandlin and Wilson and James White and others have taken on the guise of, in Tolkien's trilogy, of Saruman. They seem to think that if they can just make all the orcs Christian, then that will overthrow Sauron, and it'll all be all right. But no, you can't take Sauron's project and Christianize it and say we're going to have Christian globalism or Christian Babelism. And yet that seems to be what they're arguing. Sixthly, St. Paul destroys Sandlinism when he talks about the particular besetting sins of the Crete people in Titus. All people, he talks about, as one of your own poets have said, Cretes are always liars. All people do not look the same in their rebellion against God and his Christ. Different people who express their fallenness, each in their own unique way, as a peculiar to their own people group. So apparently, again, there are different ways you can take that passage in Titus, But one way to take that is that the Cretans had a particular besetting sin as a people group of lying. So, particular people groups have their own particular besetting sins, and particular people groups are going to have their own particular strengths. And what conversion and what grace does is, again, it makes Cretes the best Cretes they can be. It makes the Hottentots the best Hottentots they can be. It makes the Welsh or the Cornish people the best Welsh or Cornish people they can be. And it's not the case that we become interchangeable cogs. I am a post-millennialist, and so I know the idea of these chaps will one day be put down, this, for lack of a better way, Christian Unitarianism. Still, I pray that God might be gracious to them before they die and grant them repentance. I have no doubt that they may well be brothers, but even as Paul has stern words at times for brothers, so stern words are required here. And frankly, it's hard for me to see. Maybe somebody can write me and put me on the right course, but I don't know how the Christian faith can once again flourish and cover the globe until we get done with this idea that Sandlin and Boot, Wilson and James White and others are trying, Albert Mohler, can't forget him, are trying to put forward, that once somebody becomes a Christian, that then we're all the same, as if all distinctions go away. Well, that's what I have for this Iron Rhetoric podcast. Thank you for your forbearance with me, and thanks for the time of spending listening to this discussion. Any questions, I'm glad to hear. Glad for the feedback we get. God's blessings upon you, and good night.
Thank you for joining us today. Look for us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube Music. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, like, and share.